On an October night in 1923, Walter Dymock jumped out of his second-story bedroom window. But he didn't mean to. Earlier that night, he went to bed per usual, but then something inside of him snapped. As if he was possessed, Walter Dymock pulled himself out of bed, opened his window, and jumped. Yet this was not a singular event. Walter's coworkers were experiencing bizarre symptoms too, like William McSweeney. Earlier that same week, he came home from work feeling sick. And the next day, he was lashing out uncontrollably at things that weren't there. 4 men had to pin him down to put him in a straitjacket. Another man suddenly dropped 22 pounds in 4 weeks. But the worst case, by far, was Ernest Olgert. He told his boss that he was experiencing delirium at work, having terrifying hallucinations of things coming at him all at once, but there was nothing or no one there. A day later, Olgert died. After his death, the doctors noticed strange beads of gas bubbling off of his body for hours after he had died. The news headlines came flooding in as more men continued to die and more men began to suffer these strange symptoms. It would be 40 years before one scientist discovered the culprit behind all of these strange cases, and another 20 years more before the government did anything about it. This is the story of the most important scientist you've never heard of, Dr. Clair Patterson.
Well, I was born in a small town in the middle of Iowa, midst of farmland, rolling prairie type farmland in central Iowa.
Since he was young, Clair was incredibly bright. He had this ability to connect the dots that others weren't seeing. It was that kind of thinking that got him working on something called the Manhattan Project, creating the atomic bomb.
There was a chemistry professor at the University of Iowa who said, "Patterson, you've got to go to the University of Chicago and work on the atomic bomb."
In Oak Ridge, everything was top secret, as one can imagine. Pat didn't realize that he was at the very center of this entire project, since he was tasked with producing what went inside the bomb, uranium. But why uranium specifically? What exactly is it about uranium that makes it this perfect, deadly substance for the job? Uranium is an element, and it's the heaviest element that occurs in our natural world. And just to go back to basic chemistry, every element consists of neutrons, electrons, and protons. And each element has a different number of electrons, protons, and neutrons. And uranium has the most at 238. That is a lot for a natural occurring element. The more dense an element is, the more unstable it becomes. This is key because the entire premise behind an atom bomb is splitting the atom apart, which uranium does naturally on its own.
In the case of uranium, the end product is the stable element lead.
Uranium is so unstable that it's in a constant state of decay, looking for a more stable arrangement. And that was what Pat was working on. Now, Pat had his master's degree in molecular spectroscopy, so his task at Oak Ridge was to use this new machine called the mass spectrometer. A mass spectrometer allows you to isolate and identify different elements within a piece of matter, and in this situation, it was in pieces of rocks. So Pat took pieces of granite rock, pulverized them, ran them through the mass spec, and isolated the uranium found inside. He spent 2 years doing just this, building up a store of purified uranium for the atom bomb. When the US dropped the first bomb in Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, Pat was horrified.
These professor mentors, they knew that they were working as engineers on a hideous weapon, warfare, and they conveyed to young people like me that this is the thing to do, this hideous crime we were committing.
So after the war in 1945, Pat left to try and get as far away as possible from this work. So he went back to university at the University of Chicago to get his PhD in chemistry. Shortly after starting, a professor called Pat up and asked him, "Hey Pat, I'm trying to answer a question. How old is the Earth?" At that point, we didn't know because no one had ever tried to find out. So for the rest of Pat's life, he committed himself to finding the age of the Earth. Ironically, the key to answering this scientific question came from the very thing he was trying to get away from: uranium. And this is where the story really begins. As a reminder, uranium is found in rocks and is constantly decaying to release a proton here and a proton there. When uranium decays, it transforms into a different element, a more stable element. It decays to radium, polonium, bismuth, and then ultimately, it turns to lead. The process of decaying to the final state of lead is a slow but predictable process. So for example, if you have a rock that was pure uranium when it was first formed, and you look at it in present day and see that it has about 2 grams of lead in it, then you can mathematically work backwards to determine how long ago that rock was formed. Uranium provides a natural clock that allows you to date these rocks. But the thing is, how the heck do you know which rock is the oldest rock? There are literally so many rocks on this planet. How in the world are you supposed to find a rock that was created at the same time as the Earth? Well, here's what we know about our solar system in general. Our solar system was created all at the same time, meaning Jupiter wasn't created first and then Mars. It was all created together. In the creation of our solar system, one part didn't fully form as a planet, and that's the asteroid belt. One of these rocks in the asteroid belt is 150 feet long, and as it was floating along, another big rock gently tapped it and threw it slightly off course. Around 48,000 BC, during the Ice Age, this rock came hurtling towards Earth in a fiery vengeance and made impact. Some of that rock survived and is on display at a museum near the impact site in Canyon Diablo, Arizona. This rock is only 3 feet long, but if you are able to pick it up and haul it to your car, you get to keep it. I think the last time they measured it, it clocked in around 1,406 pounds. That is all to say, Pat knew for sure that this piece of rock was made at the same time as the Earth and therefore could help answer his question. However, before Pat went for the real deal, he decided to practice on other rocks to make sure he had his method down pat. So Pat took some granite back to his lab and measured it, but the numbers were super off. The lead content was through the roof for a piece of granite rock that he knew wasn't that old. So Pat decided to run a blank sample to calibrate the system. Pat was measuring the rock in a vial, so he takes the rock out and measures the vial on his own. It still comes back positive for lead. So he buys pure glass vials free of lead, so there should be no trace elements inside. He ran the sample again, and it was still positive for lead. Pat stopped and thought for a moment. The sample he had tested had water in the vial, and the water was coming from lead pipes. So he thought, that's it, that's the problem, it's the water. So this time Pat triple distilled the water and captures the water in a pure glass vial free of lead, no contamination. He ran the sample again and it was a little bit better, but still positive for lead, all without even putting the granite rock inside of it.
There was lead there that didn't belong there, and it was more. Where did it come from? Well, it might have come from this, it might have come from B, it might have come from C.
At this point, Pat was a man on a mission. Forget measuring the age of the Earth. He was determined to find the source of this pesky lead. So he took a step back and looked at the immediate surroundings in his lab. He eyed the walls and saw that the paint was peeling. So he took a sample and tested it, and lo and behold, it was positive for lead. So he repainted the walls. Once that was done, he wrapped everything in saran wrap, including the floor, so that the mass spec had no chance of picking up anything in the room. After all that, Pat ran the sample again. And once again, the lead numbers did come down quite a bit, but it was still positive for lead. Then one day, one of Pat's hairs fell on the desk with the mass spec. and the lead levels skyrocketed. That was a big aha moment. There was lead on him, so he shaved his head. But he didn't stop there. He tested some of his skin cells, and of course, it was positive for lead. There was lead in literally everything. So Pat created an anteroom, which was essentially a small room or chamber that came just before you entered the lab. In the anteroom, you had to strip down to your knickers, wear a clean hazmat-type suit that was pre-washed in acid, wear booties for your feet, and an all-encompassing hairnet. If all of this sounds familiar to you, it should, because Pat invented the very first clean room, which of course is very much still in use today. In fact, I don't think we can imagine medicine or research without it. Eventually, with the implementation of the clean room, Pat was able to get his samples down to 0.1 micrograms of lead exposure. It took years to get to this point, and he hadn't even begun to measure the rocks. True greatness takes time. Finally, Pat was ready to test out the real thing. The momentous occasion began late at night when Pat was alone in the lab. He popped the sample with the granite into the mass spec, and the mass spec calculated the rock to be 4.5 billion years old. That is how old the Earth is. 4.5 billion years old. What a spectacular moment that must have been. In that moment, Pat was the only person in the entire planet that knew this information. That is historically an essential part of who we all are as inhabitants of this planet. Of course, Pat went on to publish his findings with a feeling of triumph. If his paper was equivalent to posting on social media today, he got 0 likes and 0 views. Nobody cared how old the Earth was. 7 years of his life for a nice-to-know fact. But Pat was a smart man. He knew that the true goldmine of information was what he discovered during the process of finding the age of the Earth, which was that lead was in everything.
No one cared about, who cares? Even today, people don't care how old the Earth is. But I discovered in all this work a story related to lead.
Our lives, our business, our cities are patterned on motor transportation which gasoline has made possible.
He went on to tell his concept that lead was in everything, but no one bought it. And those that did believe him thought, okay, what's the big deal? Is lead bad? There wasn't enough knowledge about the element to really spook anyone into action. And what knowledge they did have portrayed lead as a natural element.
The lead belt of southeastern Missouri, the largest lead mining operation in the United States in 1720.
So if it's natural, it must not be harmful.
First, second, and third cars to finish have added ethyl fluid to their gasoline. Tetraethyl lead, the basic ingredient of today's ethyl fluid.
Pat thought it was abnormal to have so much lead in absolutely everything in both living and inanimate objects. He felt that lead wasn't always around. And one way he could prove his hypothesis was by testing the water from the permafrost. The permafrost contains air particles that settle onto a snowflake, that settle onto the ground, and froze over from thousands of years ago. And it was a perfect snapshot in time of what the air quality was like back then. So Pat took chunks of the permafrost in Greenland back to his lab and tested it. And what he found was fascinating. He found that starting in the 1750s, around the time of the Industrial Revolution, lead levels went up, and up. There was nearly a 300-fold increase in lead from the 1700s to present day. But there was a particularly significant moment where lead levels skyrocketed in 1930. So what the heck happened in 1930? The answer is leaded gasoline.
Do you realize what gasoline means to this country? The freedom of movement, of individual transportation, anywhere, anytime, for everybody in America.
In 1921, car makers were trying to figure out how to get rid of something called engine knocking. Back in the day when you drove your car, the engine would make this annoying clicking or knocking sound that would also cause the car to vibrate, and it was incredibly irritating as a driver. So chemical engineers tried to figure out a way to get rid of the knocking. They worked their way down the periodic table of elements until they got to lead. They put a teaspoon of lead into the gasoline, and the knocking, as if by magic, disappeared. And that is how we got leaded gasoline.
To prevent fuel knock, refineries usually add minute quantities of tetraethyl lead.
By the 1960s, pretty much all cars were running on leaded gasoline, and that was going into the air and contaminating everything.
Fill up wherever you see this famous ethyl emblem.
There's a difference, a powerful difference between gasoline
and ethyl.
Gasoline.
However, Pat got a real shock when he started to analyze more ancient ice samples. Turned out that ice before 1750 wasn't pure either. There was lead dating all the way back to 100 BCE. And that makes sense if you think about it. 6,000 years ago, humans extracted silver from smelting sulfide ores. In ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China, they used lead to bolster glass. Then the Babylonians glazed their pottery with lead. Ancient Romans even used lead acetate to sweeten their wines. In fact, humans produced 80,000 tons of lead from 700 BCE to 180. This occurrence marks the oldest large-scale hemispheric pollution ever reported, long before the Industrial Revolution. Ancient Rome used lead for everything, for their homes, for their baths, for their towns, for their water supply. And Rome was aware of the dangers of lead as well. The Roman architect Vitruvius begged the senators to not use lead, but use terracotta instead. But his pleas would fall on deaf ears. And because of this, various scholars attribute the fall of the great Roman Empire not to war, but to lead. If the dangers of lead have been common knowledge since antiquity, then how is it that we suddenly all have historical amnesia? Whatever the case, Pat was determined to jog everyone's memories. So once more, Pat published his findings, and once again, big yawn.
Now, these are chimpanzees, idiots. They're wrong, okay? And I knew that, okay? Now,
People were like, okay, yeah, maybe there's a ton of lead in the atmosphere, but there's not lead in us, so...
It's all good, man.
Pat took this as a challenge and got his hands on a 2,000-year-old ancient Peruvian skeleton. He took their teeth, ground them up, and measured them. As a point of comparison, he took his children's baby teeth, ground those up, and measured those. Lead replaces calcium, so your bones act as a sink for lead. So Pat compared the ratio of lead to calcium in the ancient bones versus the modern bones. He found that his kids' teeth had 600 times more lead in them than the ancient skeleton. In fact, all modern humans had 600 times more lead in their bones than their ancestors. At this point, there was lead in practically everything.
Such as ammunition, tight metal, foil, tubes, plumbing systems, chemical industry, power transmissions in the form of white lead.
Finally, Pat gets some traction. Environmental scientists visit Pat's lab, studied his techniques, and used it to systematically remove lead from paint, pencils, etc. However, Ethyl Corp, a fuel additive company that was the main manufacturer of leaded gasoline, fired back with their own studies. Their studies somehow proved that leaded gasoline was not harmful to the public.
Take it from me, Mel Allen.
This left the US government unsure of which way to rule. But then 2 independent studies came out that supported Pat's views. One in the Lancet and one in the New England Journal of Medicine showed that children who had higher blood lead levels had lower IQs. And that was the final nail in the coffin. And finally, in 1970, the EPA issued the Clean Air Act, heavily influenced by Pat's findings, which required regulations on additives for fuel including leaded gasoline. It took 6 years for the EPA regulations to be enforced, but once they did, the lead levels plummeted just like Pat predicted. Further studies show that a 50% decrease in leaded gasoline levels correlated with a 37% decrease in blood lead levels. The government started to phase out the use of leaded gasoline in the 1970s, but it would still take another 20 years before the US government officially banned the use of leaded gasoline by December 31st, 1995. So going back to the story in the beginning of those Ohio workers that were going mad from the strange gas. These patients had one thing in common. They all worked in an experimental refinery in Bayway, New Jersey that produced tetraethyl lead. When men were assigned to the tetraethyl lead floor, they'd mockingly say farewells and tell Undertaker jokes. Everyone knew Standard Oil, a tetraethyl lead facility, as the loony gas building that churned out the crazies. Many people died from this, but it was all essentially hushed up by Ethyl Corp, this leaded gasoline manufacturer that was made up of General Motors, DuPont, and Standard Oil. But what does lead do to the body? What makes it so toxic? Lead is deadly because your body confuses it with calcium, which is the most abundant mineral in your body. Lead is a sneaky Trojan horse that hijacks the body and replaces calcium with itself, all without the body even knowing. It kills neurons, damages DNA, and weakens your blood-brain barrier, the lining in your brain that prevents toxic or deadly substances from invading your brain. All of this can damage your IQ or even worse, cause death. That is lead poisoning. Tetraethyl lead is like lead, but on steroids. Just a few spoonfuls splashed onto your skin can kill you. It absorbs into your skin, into your blood, and ultimately into your brain to cause those horrifying symptoms that these workers were experiencing. The 1970s saw lead levels at a historic high, and thanks to Pat's work, those levels have now dropped to medieval time era. Thanks to this man, Dr. Clair Patterson, the most important scientist you've now heard of. And that is the equally fascinating and horrifying story of how we discovered the age of the Earth and that lead was in everything.
Look, I'm stupid, all right? I'm not some brilliant person or whatever. I'm a little child. And I'm not smart. I mean, good scientists are like, they have the minds of children to see through all this facade of all this other stuff that they know is stupid nonsense. They don't know stuff. They just don't see it the way other people see it. Okay, so I'm not smart. So anyway, so it's only circumstantial. It's not, look, that's why I don't feel any honor. I'm not to be, it's not there, not qualified to be honored. I mean, I'm just simply, it's accidental.
Thanks for watching. Bye. If you like the story and want more of it, I post similar videos pretty much on a daily basis on all my social media channels, which I will link in the description below. If you want to hear this in an audio version, I host a weekly science podcast called The Deadly Dose, where we drop episodes every single Wednesday. But until next time, I will see you at my next story in 2 weeks. Thanks for watching. Bye.